All right. Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today is a very, very special treat. It's something I've been waiting for a long time with both of my special guests here. We're continuing on with the Shroud Wars, specifically my panel review part 16, where I had the Shroud skeptic Hugh Farey on presenting his own image forming theory. This is his idea. He thinks that he can explain the shroud as a purely medieval artistic work through the Quem Quearitis ritual. And yeah, he came on and gave his view, to which Giulio Fanti did a peer-reviewed paper responding to. But I wanted to bring on it. This is part 16C, and I wanted to bring on a couple of experts, obviously, starting with Dr. Brian Donley Worrell to my immediate left. Hey, Brian, how are you?
Hello, how are you doing? Thank you for having us today.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure. And of course, STURP scientist, Dr. Kenneth Stevenson. Hey, Ken, how are you?
Great. Looking forward to this.
Awesome. So yeah, basically we're going to be responding to Hugh Farey's blog, kind of trying to defend his image forming hypothesis. But before we get into the topic, each of my guests, this is your first time doing an actual panel show with me. So Brian, I kind of want to go to you first to just take some time to introduce the audience as to who you are, a bit about your background and shroud studies, and anything else you want to say.
Sure, Dale. Thank you very much. And again, thank you for having us today. We really do appreciate it. And we really look forward to just chatting with you today and I think this will go great. My name is Dr. Brian Donley Worrell. My background is in both science, engineering, and also in theological studies. My undergrad degree is actually a degree in chemistry, so I've spent a lot of time in chemistry labs and doing a lot of scientific work, etc. And later in life, I branched out a little more and got my doctoral degree in theological studies. So I have sort of scientific as well as a theological background. Spent a number of years working in the Fortune 500 internationally, and really was introduced to the Shroud of Turin really before I came in touch with my very good personal friend, Dr. Kenneth Stevenson. Uh, I do want to say one word to your viewers very quickly. You guys are really in for a treat. To give you the best synopsis that I can, I don't know if you had a chance to see the musical Hamilton that was out years ago. Dale, did you ever get to see Hamilton?
I didn't. I don't think I've ever seen a play, to be
Okay,
honest.
well,
Yeah.
okay. Well, a number of your viewers, I'm sure, are familiar with the Hamilton. There's a there's a song in the Hamilton musical that says, "I want to be in the room where it happens." Hamilton is basically saying, "I want to be in that room with the decision makers making the decisions, really knowing what's going on. I want to be in the room where it happens, and I want to be one of the people making it happen." Well, I share this with your viewers today because today you guys have a treat upon which you cannot place enough value. My very good and respected close personal friend, Dr. Kenneth E. Stevenson, was in the room where it happened. In fact, Dr. Kenneth Stevenson was one of the people who literally made it happen. He was one of the members of the Shroud of Turin research project back in 1978, I believe was the year. And again, I'll leave all the details for him, but you guys are in for a great treat because he is literally, and I mean this sincerely, Dr. Stevenson is one of the world's foremost authorities on the Shroud of Turin. He also has just a tremendous scientific as well as theological background. And he's just a pleasure to listen to, and you guys are going to learn so much. So, as I said, this is the man who was in the room where it happened and when it happened, and I mean that literally. He's also one of the men who made it happen. So, with that, I'll introduce my good friend, Dr. Kenneth E. Stevenson.
Thank you, Brian. And let me just say, um, Brian suggested to me when we finally did connect that, first of all, he wrote a wonderful forward, not a forward, but a review that ended up in the front of my what I believe to be my most important book, Nazar, White Linen, and the Blood of Sprinkling. And there are two comments in there from reviewers, one from Brian and one from another STURP member, D. German, who prided himself in being the group's resident agnostic. Up until the time he was given the presentation, he said it was like the Lord tapped him on the shoulder and said, "You've seen it, you've touched it, you've studied it all these years, and you're still proud to be an agnostic." And he said something inside of him broke, and he gave his heart to the Lord. Anyway, Brian came along, and after prayer, he said, "We need to give a book away for free." And at first, I kind of took that a little, wait a minute, I'm an author. Authors are supposed to use their books to sell their books and to pay for their work. But of course, my wife would quickly add that over the years, I've probably given away as many books as I've actually sold because I believe in the subject matter. And for my own background, I have an engineering degree from the United States Air Force Academy. I have a master's from the University of Pittsburgh in writing, English, and literature. I have two doctorates, and those are both ministry. Well, one is ministry, one is theology. And so I too come to the table with a scientific and spiritual background. And before I delve into why I almost believe it's a waste, a tremendous waste of time to fool around with people like Hugh Farey, who I would say, my dad was a great punster. He would say that somebody had a concrete mind. I said, "What do you mean concrete?" And he said, "Thoroughly mixed up and permanently set." And that's the way this man is, because for him to come out with theories that have been so debunked and continue to say it's a medieval forgery, I just marvel. And so I want to begin with two things. First, I want to, for your readers' benefit, I've written 5 books, edited the 6th. This is the one I edited. It's the Proceedings of the 1977 U.S. Conference of Research on the Shroud of Turin. This and the 3D got our foot in the door in Italy because we gathered some 40 scientists approximately from the top labs in the country, if not in the world. NASA, the Jet Propulsion Lab, Sandia, Los Alamos, the Brooks Institute of Photography, and of course, faculty members like myself at the Air Force Academy. And we put together this wonderful book, which, like I say, opened the door in Italy, especially when they saw that using only a 1933 glass photograph by Giuseppe Enrique, we were able to reproduce a 3-dimensional from the shroud using a spin-off of space technology. But I'll take it a step further. In this book, early in the book, I write the following. And I say this to Hugh and anyone who would be deceived by his self-deception. Indeed, the incredible discoveries that really only began in Turin in 1978 continue to this day. And for the most part, those who are still alive, that's only 12 of us now, and who were with us in Turin, continue to try to fathom the depths of the mystery of the Shroud of Turin. Furthermore, while there are differences of opinion about what may have caused the image, there's virtually unanimous agreement that the shroud is not a fake. It is a real burial garment that contains imprints and images of a man whose crucifixion and death is exactly the same as that described in the Gospels for Jesus of Nazareth. In fact, at the planned dissolution of STURP, it's not well known, but STURP had planned to dissolve. And for the most part, the reason they planned to dissolve is because there was a desire to continue to study, but there was also a fear among many of them, a fear I didn't share, that in order to speak spiritually about the shroud, it would jeopardize your scientific reputation. I disagree. I disagree wholeheartedly. So STURP was getting ready to devolve, but this is what they put out as a closing statement after 3.5 years of intensive research, peer reviewed, debate. We got together around this country, I don't know how many times, to discuss our findings. Here's what they said. We can conclude for now that the shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. The blood stains are composed of hemoglobin and also give a positive test for serum albumin. The image is an ongoing mystery, and until further chemical studies are made, perhaps by this group of scientists or perhaps by other scientists in the future, the problem remains unsolved. STURP only stopped short of saying it was Jesus because of the fear that I mentioned to you before. And in fact, at that dissolution meeting, the news reporters were all over them. You got to understand, I was the spokesman, editor, and recording secretary for STURP. I had done Good Morning America, Today Show, so many different things. I was probably in more magazines and newspapers than I care to think about. Today, People, Us, Newsweek, Time, Life, Saturday Evening Post. And every one of them would ask me if I thought it was Jesus. They never doubted my scientific background. They never questioned my scientific. The only ones who question it are people who have already decided that in their mind, it's got to be a forgery. Now, Brian mentioned that I was in the room. And Hugh takes a page from the late Dr. Walter McCrone. I was in the room when Walter McCrone came to one of our meetings. He had been invited by the late Dr. Ray Rogers, who did most of our chemical research. And Dr. Ray Rogers was a wonderful man of God who regretted greatly ever getting McCrone involved. And McCrone comes in and says, all you guys who believe this is real can pack up and go home. Well, you could have heard a pin drop, because after that length of time, I would say most of us were convinced, even before we made this statement, that we were looking at a real burial garment, even though many wouldn't want to say whether they believed it was Jesus publicly. Privately, most of them did. I believe it was nearly 30 out of 40 who privately said, yeah, it's got to be Jesus. Some waffled a little bit on the possibility that someone else was crucified like Jesus in order to create the image, but they still believed it was a human body. And McCrone came up with this incredible theory of an iron oxide painting. Basically, what he was saying is jeweler's rouge, which wasn't invented until hundreds, if not 1,000 years after the image was already known to exist. So to come up with these things, and then Ray Rogers said it, and after he left, I will say this: the members of STURP wanted to send a letter to Yale to get a second opinion on the Vinland map. For those of you who don't know, McCrone earned his reputation by debunking Yale's Vinland map. Funny thing, he used the same exact theory. It was an iron oxide painting. The same exact theory. And one of the guys found in his textbook, in McCrone's textbook, that you're the expert, you're a microscopist, you're the expert. If you don't like the results of your test, put the results down that you wanted. In other words, lie. I'm sorry, these are facts. And over the years, it's been my privilege to write about the Shroud. As I said, I've written 5 books, edited a 6th. Carbon-14 came out. I was accosted in Turin as the spokesman by Harry Gove, the late Harry Gove. And he basically was saying that the church didn't want to do carbon-14 because carbon-14 would reveal it was a fake. He had already decided it was a fake. I didn't realize how many of these people in the carbon-14 field were already convinced it was a fake and just wanted an opportunity to say so. But it was my privilege also to write the foreword for the 1988 carbon-14 dating the Shroud of Turin, a stunning expose, and it was stunning. It really was what was revealed. The fact of the matter is there was so much other peer-reviewed science. The fact of the matter is that when they talked about the carbon-14, Gary Habermas and I wrote a book called The Shroud and the Controversy. And we put out 14 protocols established by a carbon-14 expert, Bill Meekum. All 14 were violated by the three labs that did this test. Plus, it wasn't a double-blind study. They knew the shroud when they were looking at it. Plus, they got some errors in the test sample. And then they had the nerve to come out and say it's a fake. It's a medieval fake. Had they come out and said it's a real burial garment, but it's medieval, it might have had a totally different impact. Instead, they had the gall to come out and say it was a fake. Now, I want to share one quick story, and I've been running my mouth enough. We'll let Brian speak for a little while.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead, please. Really, really.
To share too. Dr. Gary Habermas, my dear friend, my dear brother in the Lord, is the chair of theology at Liberty Baptist University. He was giving a defense of his dissertation, and the defense was that he had put up all the extra biblical evidence that could be amassed for the resurrection. That's what his dissertation was about. Extra biblical evidence for the resurrection. When he got finished, a Jewish professor, by the way, not a religious Jewish professor, a secular Jewish professor, said, "This is a great job, but you missed the most important evidence." And Gary just pondered, what could this Jewish guy know that I missed? And what is the most important evidence that I missed? And the guy told him the Shroud of Turin. Well, to make a long story short, Gary called STURP. STURP referred him to me as the spokesman. Gary came down to New Orleans, where I was living at the time, and spent a week there picking my brain, and ended up, we co-authored Verdict on the Shroud, which ended up in 16 languages and went around the world and touched lives. And maybe at the end of today's show, I'll share one of the most touching things that came out of that book. But let me just say, to me, after nearly 50 years of research, the shroud is not only the authentic burial garment of Jesus Christ, not only evidence of how he died and how he was buried, evidence of his resurrection, and more importantly, evidence that is confirmed repeatedly by scripture, even things I didn't know until I wrote Nazah. When I began to look at the ancient Hebrew and learn what I learned, I believe this is the time for the shroud to come into its own so that many lives can be touched with the gospel. Simple as that. People, look at the state of the world. Look at where we seem to be heading. And why would somebody be embarrassed, upset, bent out of shape because there's evidence for the doubting Thomas of our generation? I think the shroud provides that evidence.
Well said. Yeah, thank you so much to both of you for coming on and sharing knowledge about the shroud, and especially evaluating Hugh Farey's hypothesis, because so many skeptics online have fallen for it. They think, hey, look, he's reproduced the shroud and stuff. So I think it's great to bring you two experts on to evaluate this and show what the problems are. Now, just before I go back to you, Brian, to get your take on his theory, we do actually have a third guest who's not here, but Giulio Fanti. He's written a peer-reviewed paper evaluating Hugh's actual experimental results through me. He sent Giulio his results, his experiment, and he evaluated that in a peer-reviewed paper. So Giulio gave a response to Hugh's blog. It's a short thing. He just wants me to read his response, and then I'll go to you guys. So let me just read. This is what Giulio Fanti says about Hugh's blog and his method. "Quote unquote, Dear Dale, thank you for inviting me to write some comments to present during your next podcast of May 2nd. I'm very busy during this Easter period, also because I have several conferences on the Holy Shroud outside the city. However, as I promised you, I am writing you these two lines that you can read to your public. First of all, I must say, I don't like the title you give to this program because, in principle, I do not like wars. So he's referring to the Shroud Wars that I have, and even less those applied to the most important relic of Christianity. Even if you told me the intention of the Shroud Wars is not to be adversarial, but to work together as a team towards the truth, the first impression of the audience could be different from your initial intention. So fair enough. He's has his opinion on the title that I've got there. But then going into Hugh specifically, he says, on the other hand, I do not see why it is necessary to argue amongst ourselves, since we are all searching for the truth, aware of our great ignorance in the face of this object, which, as Saint John Paul II stated during his exhibition in Turin in 1999, quote unquote, the shroud is a provocation to the intelligence. The church entrusts scientists with the task of continuing to investigate. In fact, if we scientifically knew only 5% of what could be known about this relic, we would already know a lot. So, if we were all honest scholars and behaved humbly before the Holy Shroud, putting aside our frequent arrogance in wanting to prove at all costs that we are right, I believe that much more constructive results would emerge. Unfortunately, however, you have wanted to invite people like Hugh Farey on your podcasts, and a listener of your April 2025 podcast entitled Shroud Wars Panel Review Part 16B commented defining Hugh Farey in this way. Quote unquote, Hugh knows it is the truth. Otherwise, it would make no sense for him to literally dedicate his life to proving the opposite. He is a snake in the grass, and as you well know, pray for him. So Giulio says, I repeat, a snake in the grass, because instead of objectively commenting on scientific truths, Hugh, meaning Hugh Farey, very skillfully masks the aspects contrary to his goal, presenting a considerable series of information that confuses the public, not expert in the matter. And on the other hand, he makes very questionable statements in his favor. For example, as I published in the article that you patiently read on your April 2025 podcast, Hugh Farey claims to be able to reproduce the body image of the Holy Shroud using a technique modified by him and initially proposed by Emily Craig back in the 1990s, which proved to be absolutely unacceptable. So he's kind of saying what you were saying there, Ken. He keeps going on. He's almost getting towards the end, but quote unquote, microscopic analysis clearly shows that Hugh Farey is not able to reproduce the characteristics of the image fibers on the Holy Shroud, which are colored only in correspondence with their superficial layer and not with pigments or additional substances, according to a chemical coloration defined by experts as dehydration and oxidation of the primary cell wall of the individual linen fibers. In Hugh's blog, to confuse the public, Hugh Farey compares a micrograph of his linen fibers, rich in additional particles or color, obtained from his experiment with a fiber of the Holy Shroud, not of pure image, but of a bloody fiber, and therefore also rich in additional particles, namely red blood cells. Hugh Farey, in his blog, then advances a very questionable criticism of the chemical physical characteristics of the body image of the Holy Shroud, published by me, meaning Giulio Fanti, together with several experts of the Shroud Science Group, subjectively destroying, without demonstrating his point of view, extremely important characteristics, some of which have recently been recognized by an important international journal that reiterated, without having subsequently received contrary comments, the double superficiality of the body image. So he's coming to his conclusion. Consequently, I am always open to honestly and objectively discussing the results of our scientific research in order to get closer to the truth, about this very important relic, but I refuse to have discussions with certain people till they stop making arrogant statements not based on a verifiable scientific basis, but of a goal-oriented type. In addition, I do not believe it is appropriate to compare serious scientists who have
Yes.
dedicated their lives to the study of this important relic with people who continue to make statements equivalent to declaring that the Earth is flat. So Hugh, you were a flat earther apparently. So, okay, so he says, Giulio ends, I wish you all the best in being able to objectively analyze with your guests the extremely important and scientifically non-reproducible characteristics of the relic that wrapped the body of Jesus Christ. Best regards, Giulio Fanti. So that was Giulio's take on Hugh's blog, responding to his technique. So at this point, I want to turn it over to you guys. So Giulio, it was really important for me and Giulio to have a set of characteristics or properties of the shroud images by which we evaluated it. Is it a success or not? And Brian, I want to start with you and just kind of give your opening take. What is your general take on Hugh's method to reproduce the shroud images? Maybe explaining what it is for the audience too briefly, and how does it explain the various features of the shroud? How well does it perform?
Well, you asked what are my initial takes. The words laughter, disgust, and hilarity seem to leap to mind immediately. But beyond that, I enjoyed what Julio Fanti said about, if we are all honest scholars, which unfortunately we are not, and we're all
Mhm.
searching for the truth. Unfortunately,
We are
we
not.
are not. I'm just going to say it the way it is. Some people are just flat out liars. Okay. Here's what I mean by that. Just so I don't want anyone to think I'm just throwing stones. Here's what I mean. I mentioned to you earlier, I have a degree in chemistry. As a scientist, the bedrock of what we do is based upon facts. When you find something that is a fact, you run it past other scientists, and they can all determine whether or not those things are indeed facts or whether they are opinion. Once, oh, I don't know, let's say 40 of the top scientists in the world, such as the STURP group, of which Dr. Ken Stevenson was a part of the group, obviously. Once a group of the top scientists in the world in every field, as he said, from everything from National Aeronautic and Space Administration to JPL, Jet Propulsion Labs, I mean, you're talking the top scientists in the world. Once they have all agreed that different sets of information are indeed fact, and then they have it's what we call peer review. We then have other scientists say, hey, take a look at what we found. Here's all of our data. Here's all of our evidence. Here's why we believe this is fact. And what do you think? So all of these scientific peers around the world all review their findings. That's why it's called peer reviewed. And they all say, yep, we all agree. Those are indeed facts, not opinion, facts. When that happens, you then have a set of facts which are referred to as peer reviewed. I wanted to explain it that way because some of your audience may or may not be comfortable with or quite as familiar with some of the terminology that we tend to use. So once it has been established that facts are facts and that they have been peer reviewed, so other scientists say, yep, those are indeed facts. In order for a person to come along and say, hey, I have a suggestion, that's not how it works. And they say something that is not only erroneous, but laughably inconsiderate of what has been considered peer-reviewed factual information. It angers me, and it's also very sad. It makes me very sad at the same time. It's you have people who are not in our field, who are not scientists,
Yes.
to whom they can say things and sound very convincing. And if those folks who are not in the scientific realm, or maybe just haven't really heard a differing opinion or have not heard the peer-reviewed facts, when someone such as, oh, I don't know, Hugh Farey comes along and says something which is completely ridiculous. And when I say ridiculous, I don't want people to think I'm throwing stones. I define that as willingly and knowingly in violation of peer-reviewed scientific facts. That's what I mean by stupidity, okay? When you do that, in my opinion, the term I use is you're flat out lying. And again, I want people to think I'm through just throwing stones. I mean, there are so many holes in his theory. I mean, so many. You can't even begin to count them. I'll pick just one of many. Um, One of the bases of Hugh Farey's paper is he's saying that this process called bas relief can reproduce the shroud, and he's saying, you know, part of it entails there is some kind of substance that's placed upon it. Well, the shroud of Turin itself actually contains no other substances, no Ken, what word do I want to use? I want to be a little more specific there. There are
Well,
no, not only
this
pigments, there are no pigments is a good word. There are no
no
pigments
pigments, and
that
this is a
apply
good
to it.
time for me to jump in on what
Please
Brian's
do.
saying, because the facts that are peer reviewed, I want to mention just a few of them. Peer reviewed facts: the shroud image is superficial. Peer reviewed facts: only the upper curved surface of the fibers of the threads. Two, it's photographically negative. Probably the easiest characteristics for modern science having cameras to reproduce. Three, it's encoded with three-dimensional information. And I want to state unequivocally, none of the man-made images produce the accurate three-dimensional information that we get from the shroud. None. I've seen bodies, I've seen bas reliefs, I've seen paintings, all of it. None of it produces an accurate 3D. But by the way, that's a spin-off of space technology used to map out the surface of the moon. We'll talk about that another time. Four, it's composed of degraded, dehydrated cellulose fibers. Five, it's non-directional. What do you mean non-directional? No brushstrokes, no lines, nothing that includes the making of a man's hand. Okay? Six, it's detailed enough for a virtual autopsy. Seven, it's thermally stable. Heat doesn't change it. Eight, it's chemically stable. Nine, it's water stable. 10, it's positive in the infrared. It was my privilege to take a videotape machine, a videotape camera, while the shroud was bathed in infrared light. And I can attest that the shroud image in the infrared is positive, not negative. And one of the things that, if ever there's another scientific group that studies it, that I would strongly suggest is look carefully at what information is in the infrared. Because if it's similar, positive infrared, perhaps that's a key to locating the type of energy that would have caused it. Now, it's sepia toned. I need to point out that as the shroud ages, the color of the linen is catching up because it's dehydrating, it's aging. And unless there's a way to stabilize it, and I know there's a lot of different suggestions, I don't know how effective they've been, you might eventually not see the image anymore. And this is very vital to any man-made theory, this next one. The blood on the shroud prevents image formation. It obviously had to be there first. Fact. Most of the ones that come up with a man-made theory say, oh yeah, you use a bas relief, you use a painting technique, you use a dusting technique, whatever they want to do, and then you add the blood later. Nope, doesn't work. Scientific fact, the blood was there first. 13, the blood was human. 14, the color spectrum is very similar to a scorch, which has suggested some type of energy form creating the image in the first place. I love this one because, Brian, this is basically what you said. It's never been successfully duplicated. Anybody who says so has a real problem with the truth. I don't want to call him a liar outright, but hey, if the shoe fits. There's no pigment, powder, or dye. And this I love the most as a pastor. It's scripturally accurate. When you put all those facts together, please explain to me how Hugh Farey, Harry Gove, Walter McCrone, Skeptical Inquirer, Steve Schafferman, how any of them can justify saying this is a faith. And speaking of which, they start with the medieval date of the carbon dating. Hey, want to talk some peer review? Ray Rogers, who, again, was very sad about having ever invited Walter McCrone. He almost cost us the whole testing profile, by the way. That's another story. Ray Rogers spent the last days of his life looking at errors in the carbon dating. And he came away convinced that the reason the date was wrong is it mostly dated cotton. Cotton is not a Middle Eastern fabric, and cotton was woven into the shroud following the fire that occurred. Hello? Are you with me yet? When he died, he gave all of his basic research to a fellow scientist at Los Alamos, and he said, please, you're not involved, you're not a part of this. And I don't believe that scientist was a Christian, by the way. He asked him, would you check my work? That scientist came to a conference that I attended, and he basically said, Ray was right. The reason they got a date of the Middle Ages is because they dated cotton, not the actual linen. And I guess since most of the people involved are no longer with us, can I tell you that there was a secret dating that was done? And it came out that it was very likely 2,000 years old. The reason it was secret is there was no unbroken chain of custody with the sample that was used for that date. So anybody could question it.
Gotcha. Awesome. All right. So I think at this point, before we get into evaluating Hugh's method, it is important because one, as you guys have alluded to, Hugh is known for flat out denying certain facts that we would say have to be replicated in order to be considered a success. So I have about 3 or 4 that I'd like to go over with you guys, kind of thing. But I'll just play a clip. So the first is superficiality. And in particular, Hugh denies the thread level superficiality. He says, STURP, they never proved that it's only the top 2 to 3, or as Roger says, 2 to 4 layers. That can't be proven. But even if it is proven, there's nothing special about that because, look, he's coated a paint, linen thing in paint, and it's superficial. So let me just play that 3-minute clip so you can see what Hugh is claiming here. All right, so share sound. Hopefully, is that popping up for you guys?
Here it comes.
Okay, so just a 3-minute clip. This is Hugh's take on the superficiality.
Now, how about this? So I took a piece of this stuff and I absolutely soaked it. I didn't want it to. I didn't want to cheat by only staining one side of it. So I pumped up and down on my thing like that. And then I got a paintbrush and I painted it so it was thoroughly soaked on both sides. That's a strip of my cloth. And then, as you see, I rolled it up and sealed it with sticky tape. And then I cut it in half. And then I cut a tiny slice out of the middle. And to my delight, I have to say, can you see that the paint, however hard I try, I cannot make it penetrate those fibers?
Well, but
Yeah, the paint, the fibers are beautifully clear. Yep.
well, it does look there like there are areas where there are much thicker areas of brown.
Yeah. Yes. Because if you look at from the outside, you can see that. I mean, from the top left-hand side, from the top right-hand side, I should say, we can see the threads, which by coincidence are the the threads that are going around in circles, whereas the brown threads are the threads which are going vertically up and down. But if we look at the close-up of the brown threads, we can see that the reason they appear brown is an illusion of the light. We can see that they are, in fact, completely clear, and that the paint is only seeped into the outside layer of the fibers.
All right, so that's the clip. So in the first place, Hugh, number one, he denies that that STURP proved that the shroud's superficial. It's not a fact, according to him, that it's only the top 2 to 3 layers. But then he
I
said,
wish
even
I had known you were going to share that. If I had, and I'm sure Brian could confirm this, I would screen share with you a actual microscopic photograph from the shroud itself. And anybody with half of eyesight could see the difference between what he put on your screen and what the shroud actually looks like. Again, it questions not only his veracity, but is willing to twist the truth in order to try to make a case. It fails miserably. There is a image that I use in my presentation. And on the image, you can see dirt that goes around the fibers. You can see blood that goes around the fibers. But the image itself clearly, absolutely clearly reveals itself to be superficial. So again, bogus, bogus, bogus.
And just before I get Brian's take on that thing, what did you make of what he was arguing in the clip? He was saying, look, even if it is superficial, he's like, look, so what? I can soak this cloth in paint and I also get superficial results. What do you make of that?
It's a lie.
Yeah,
There's no other way to say it. It's a
that's true. It's a lie.
And I get tired, it's like I said at the beginning, why are we even having this debate? This stuff has been debunked and disproven so many times as to, hey, why am I wasting my time with this guy? Let me just say this. I recently went to a wonderful shroud exhibit put on at Prestonwood Baptist Church in Plano, Texas. Put on by a pastor who was formerly a diehard skeptic against the shroud, having read people like Hugh and others who say it's a fake, and having read the carbon-14 who say it's a fake, on and on and on. And he became a believer when he got the facts. Brian mentioned it. Facts are facts. And when you have to twist a fact to make a case, you're not truthful. You're not truthful at all. And the problem I have with that is why? Can I suggest something that may offend somebody, but it's the truth as I understand it and believe it? Some people don't want to believe this in the same reason so many people, and you can research this and find out what I'm telling you is true. So many people back in the day grabbed Darwin's theory. And when asked why, they said because it interfered with our mores. It interfered with how we wanted to live life and believe life. And that's why we grabbed it. So here we are now, and you have directed panspermia, you have punctuated equilibrium. And I know this isn't about evolution, but the story remains the same. I think dealing with the facts of the shroud makes someone have to face up to the fact that Jesus of Nazareth lived and died exactly the way the scripture said, and he said he did it for our salvation. If they don't want to accept that, they're going to fight it tooth and nail. My opinion.
Sure. All right, cool. And Ken, if you want, you can send me those pictures and I will post that up on my blog for people after.
I'll do that.
Yeah.
That's great.
But yeah, Brian, oh, sorry. Brian, what's your take on this claim of Hugh that number one, superficiality is not a fact, and even if it is, I can do it too with paint or
Well,
something.
it's not, first of all, it's not truthful to say that he can do it as well, because um, the model that Hugh Farey used is what we call bas-relief model. Okay, I won't go into all the details of it. It gets pretty scientific, but Giulio Fanti actually demonstrated that the bas-relief process, it actually fails 8 out of 12, fails 8 out of 12 of the key features of the Shroud of Turin. For example, with the bas-relief dabbing, paint seeps into threads, paint leaves a residue, and it fails all of the forensic tests that were used by the Shroud of Turin research team, the top scientists in the world. So, and again, just to kind of make this sound a little simpler, some things are just really common sense. Imagine you have a piece of fabric. Let's say you just have a piece of cotton, you take a shirt, and I take, I don't know, a Coca-Cola and I pour it on the shirt. If that shirt gets wet, that fabric gets wet, doesn't that liquid seep into the fabric? Well, common sense, sure it does. Well, guess what? On the Shroud of Turin, there is no seepage whatsoever because there was no liquid or anything ever applied to it. Also, imagine if you, again, poured, let's say, Coca-Cola onto a cotton shirt and you left it out in the sun and you let it dry. So when you take that piece of cotton and let's say you start to just kind of scrunch it up, and you're going to wind up with all of this residue from the dried Coca-Cola, the things in the Coke, the sugar molecules, etc., that are in the Coke. If you just sort of ball up that cotton fabric, you're going to wind up with all this dust and residue on it. Well, guess what? There's no dust and no residue whatsoever on the Shroud of Turin. I mean, there are just so many, it basically fails in everything pretty much. There are, Mr. Farey's, I don't want to call it analysis, but he's not even able to really address the physiological features that are more than prominent on the Shroud of Turin. I mean, Ken can even tell you more about this. There are features on the Shroud of Turin which today, with our advanced knowledge of human biology and physiology, there are things that would have been unknown back in medieval time. So if someone in medieval time were to, I don't know, try to paint a Shroud of Turin or something like that, they would not even have the medical and physiological and biological knowledge of the human body that we have today in order to accurately even paint, which you can't, but in order to paint some kind of image like the Shroud of Turin, they would not have even had that level of physiological knowledge. I mean, it just fails on so many levels.
It absolutely does. I agree with you wholeheartedly. And some of the things about it, the postmortem bleeding, for example, the serum albumin, the creatinine that shows sign of severe trauma to the body. I mean, I could go on and on and on. You're absolutely right. But perhaps it was best put by the late Dr. Robert Buckland, who was with STURP. And Dr. Buckland was the leading county coroner for Los Angeles. And because he had both medical and law degrees, he was literally the man that they patterned the Quincy program after. And Dr. Buckland would take those photographs and show you. He did so in The Silent Witness. I had clips of it in my documentary, Behold the Man. And he basically says, this is why you can do a virtual autopsy of the man of the shroud. Like Brian said, they didn't have that medical knowledge. Let's go a step further. Artistically, they would have done something different. Why do you say that? Oh, well, he was nailed through the hands. No, he wasn't, because the hand couldn't support the weight of a body. Okay? He was nailed through the wrist. How do we know that factually? The thumbs are pulled in alongside the palm because it hits the median nerve in the wrist area. There's so many things like that. I mean, we could spend the next hour discussing that level of detail that would not be known by a medieval forger.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, and I think Giulio in his paper talks a lot about that too, the medical studies, which just automatically kind of rule out an artistic mechanism of any sort. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I'm just kind of curious, Ken, for you, because I noticed one thing you mentioned. You did say that inherently any kind of bas relief technique would fail the three dimensionality or photonegativity. Now, Giulio, in his assessment, he actually grants Hugh that yes, he gets a green check mark on the 3D. Do you know, is he just being too generous, or like why is that?
I personally, I think it's a little too generous, and let me tell you why I say that. There are some three-dimensional aspects that would occur with something like that. However, what I'm saying is the level of three dimensionality, the accuracy of three dimensionality. For example, before Turin, as the spokesman editor, and when I was doing the proceedings back in 1977, by the way, we started working in late 76. That's when the whole concept of the Shroud Turin Research Project was born. I went to Denver, Colorado, because there was a Messianic rabbi up there by the name of Eliezer Urbach. Eliezer Urbach formed an organization that you might never have heard of. It was called American Board of Missions to the Jews. But you have heard of Chosen People Ministries, which is the new name for that same organization. I went to him because John's gospel said he was buried in the manner of the Jews to bury their dead. So I asked him, I took the photographs. I asked him what we were looking at. He was the first to suggest that the sort of box with the backward looking 3 on the forehead was actually a phylactery worn by an Orthodox Jew. And since in this case it covered life blood, which would be considered sacred in Jewish tradition, it would be either left on the body or put on the body after death because it had the life blood on it, and it would be buried with the body. But then he went a step further. He said, well, if it's the forehead phylactery, there should be one on the arm. And if you look at the arms of the man of the shroud, on one arm, the blood flow is unimpeded. It goes straight down the arm. But on the other arm, it breaks in 7 breaks between the elbow and the wrist. Guess how many wrappings of leather are with that arm phylactery, which would be here where the fire damage area is? 7. Tell me again how a bas relief can produce that level of evidence. Can't be done. That's why I don't give him a green light.
And Brian, anything you wanted to say about the three dimensionality on your end, or do you agree with Ken? Or
No, Ken has really summed that up very well. He certainly has hit all of the most important points of that in such a way that even those who are not familiar with, again, the science behind what we're talking about, it's easy to understand what Ken's saying there.
gotcha. Okay, so I want to turn to this issue of so high resolution. So the STURP actually quantified, I think it's like 5 millimeters plus or minus point something, or Ken will know better than me what that is. But Hugh, one of the things Hugh admits he failed on, so he agrees with Giulio that he failed, was the image diffuseness. His images have borders, and also his images are even better resolved. They're even more highly resolved. But he excuses that and says, "Well, this isn't a failure because I'm using a 10 centimeters by 10 centimeter bas relief. So, because of the smaller scale, that explains why there's these differences here. But if it was on a wider scale, then I would be perfectly matching the shroud, and I would have diffuse images, and I wouldn't have I would have images similar to the shroud's resolution." What do you guys make of that?
Let me answer that by throwing another ridiculous argument on the table. There is the ridiculous argument that the shroud was created using a camera obscura with an actual corpse and an actual box. And how ridiculous is it to assume that you have a camera obscura that can show front and rear, 13 and a half feet. I mean, the ridiculousness of that kind of statement to me is the same thing here. He's trying to excuse away what he obviously he admits he failed at by twisting illogically, in my opinion. Oh, it's 10 centimeters, and if it were different, it wouldn't be that way. I don't buy it. I think it's again an obfuscation. I think it's again something designed to throw mud in the water, kind of cloud things up a little bit, enough so that maybe he can hope to skate by.
Yeah, Brian, no, again, Hugh admits he failed. The results he got didn't achieve the results, but he just says, oh, but that's the scale factor because it's so small. Do you think that if he were to use a bigger bas relief, those problems would go away, or would he still have those issues?
Well, he would still have those exact same issues. It's simply not created by the same process. So again, if you look at scientific fact will tell you, hey, you're not using the same process, you're not going to get the same result. You know, if my mother can really cook a great chocolate chip cookie, but I use totally different ingredients and do it a different way, it's never going to taste the same. You're not going to get the same result when you're not abiding by the same set of facts and rules. It's not going to happen.
Agreed. Well said, Brian.
Gotcha. All right, Brian, I'm going to come back to you actually because you do have some expertise in chemistry. So, look, Hugh Farey, I won't play the clip just to save time, but obviously he relies on pigment, right? He relies on Walter McCrone's findings of an iron oxide. Although interestingly, he prefers yellow ochre as opposed to red ochre, so they disagree there. The two skeptics can't get along, but he says, well, look, STURP, they didn't know what they were doing. They were out to lunch. Even STURP reports that these fibers are loaded with pigments, and he refers to like Eugenia Natowski's thing, and he points out that there are these Eugenia Natowski. She's an archaeologist, and
he wasn't with STURP. See, again, you're quoting somebody, and he's quoting STURP did this, and this person comes along and says, "Yes, STURP did that." I can't tell you the number of times I've been out giving a presentation, and afterwards I'll, have questions and answers and so on. People will come up to me and say, "Well, you know Mortimer Snerd." No, I don't. "Yeah, he was a part of STURP." No, he wasn't. I knew every member of STURP. Mortimer Snerd was not there. And unfortunately, what I think happened now, Brian is the chemical expert, so I'm going to defer to him. But let me mention something that needs to be understood about the iron oxide that was found. If you were to see, if I had the screenshot of it, of the small of the back, there's a water stain there created when water was thrown on after the 1532 fire. That water created a stain on the shroud. There is enough iron in the water to cast an X-ray, but the imagery that is clearly visible when you on the shroud to the naked eye or the camera's eye is gone with an X-ray. So please, again, explain to me how those chemicals, ochre, iron oxide, whatever, that you claim make the image disappear when you do an X-ray, but the iron oxide in the water is clearly visible.
Yeah, Brian, I'm interested in your take on this claim. Like Hugh will say, even STURP found all these particles. They found iron oxide and stuff like this, and he compares Alan Adler and Heller's work to Eugenia Natowski's photomicrographs and stuff, and says, "Look, this thing's loaded with paint."
Yeah, again, sometimes you can really just kind of completely debunk a scientific argument just with basic common sense. And I want to go with something very basic, again, because a lot of folks who are your valued listeners are not really going to be comfortable with a lot of high-level scientific language and terminology, and that's okay. They shouldn't be. But one of the things that Walter McCrone, Ken, I believe you referred to Walter earlier, one of his assertions is that, oh, look, there's all this submicron iron oxide, and that's all over the Shroud of Turin. Well, first, and he's basically saying that the submicron iron oxide was used to paint the image on the Shroud of Turin, and he theorized that it happened sometime around the medieval era. Now, that was completely and utterly false, and it was easily disproven by the entire STURP team of scientists on numerous fronts. First of all, submicron iron oxide had only been available for about 200 years, the last 200 or 300 years. So it could not have been used in a medieval painting. Number one, it didn't exist at that time. So again, just basic common knowledge, but that's just the beginning. If you examine the tape samples by the STURP team members, they found no evidence whatsoever for McCrone's theory. There were no signs whatsoever of any kind of medium, submicron iron oxide or any other medium, which a medieval artist could have used. And there was no sign whatsoever that any kind of liquid had been applied to the fibers of the shroud. Now remember, the image on the shroud is only on the very outermost fibrils of the thread. And I want the threads that make up the shroud. I want to kind of explain it this way, if I may. If you can envision the way a um, a a piece of cloth is made, if you kind of interlock your fingers like this, think of having some threads in a fabric. Some of the threads, let's say they go north and south, and some of the threads go east and west. They kind of interlock sort of in a crosswise pattern, basically. Well, when that happens, again, those are threads that are interlocking. The image on the Shroud of Turin does not penetrate the threads. It's only on the very outermost fibril or the very outermost layer of each individual thread. So again, if you are going to paint something, it's just common sense. Paint would seep into any kind of fabric. That's not what the Shroud of Turin is. There's no seepage, there's no liquid that was used. There were no traces of any kind of residue in any way. McCrone's theory was also disproven by use of X-ray fluorescence, visible light examinations of the shroud, also by various microchemical studies by STURP. So all of these tests determined there is not nearly enough iron oxide on the cloth to account for even an enhancement of an image. So his assumption is finally disproven by, again, the three-dimensionality, the superficiality, the image on the shroud is non-directional. And again, Ken mentioned earlier, non-directional simply means if you're going to paint something, when you use a paintbrush, you're going to have directionality to what you're painting. You're going to make some strokes, north and south or east and west. You're going to make other strokes in a circle or a curve. So you're applying direction to whatever direction in which you're moving your paintbrush, for example. But again, there's no directionality whatsoever to the image on the shroud. It's also absent of any plateaus. There are no saturation points in the image. They're just basically that entire theory just falls flat in every single way.
There's just a couple of follow-up questions. I have about three follow-up questions, two for Brian and one for you, Ken. But Brian, just first of all, in terms of the non-directionality, so Hugh, he doesn't use a paintbrush. He uses what the British call a pouncer or something, like a dauber or something. He dips it in paint and daubs it or something like that. Like, would that make any difference to the non-directionality, or would we still
It would make absolutely no difference whatsoever. None whatsoever. And if I'm mistaken, Ken, please let me know. But
no, you're absolutely correct.
I know I'm not mistaken.
100% correct.
Yeah,
I'm not a chemist, and I know that.
Yeah.
Now, Brian,
Wow.
the other thing I want to ask, this is directly related to the chemistry because so Hugh is of course aware, and he admits that today the majority of the image is not composed of paint. He'll actually agree with STURP, and for this reason he thinks it was washed. The shroud was washed. That's why the paint's gone. But he includes vinegar and egg yolk in his concoction, and he says it was the vinegar that was kind of like an acidic effect, or it oxidized the cellulose, and that's what creates the images as we see it today, not the paint. Now here,
Well, you said vinegar and egg yolk
hang on one
was
second.
used to paint the image on the shroud.
I can tell you specific.
Again, as a chemist, that would be a little problematic when, I don't know, the shroud caught on fire in the year 1532. Last time I checked, fire has a really interesting reaction with things like vinegar, with fabric, with egg yolk.
Yeah,
Fire has a real, effect on things like that. And when they and by the way, just to put this in perspective, when the fire occurred in 1532, the Shroud of Turin was not hanging on a coat hanger in someone's closet. It was kept inside a silver reliquary, a big, thick, heavy silver box. That's what the shroud was in 1532. So when the building caught on fire, the fire was so intense, it literally melted the silver box in which the Shroud of Turin was kept. Some of that silver melted and burned through the fabric of the Shroud of Turin. But do you know how hot the temperature has to be to melt silver? If I'm not mistaken, I think silver melts at either 1,732 degrees Fahrenheit or maybe 1,932 degrees. I may be off by one digit. Do you remember what it is, Ken?
I think
I
you're
know
right.
it's around there.
Somewhere between 17, 1800. That's what I recall.
Yeah. So it's around 17, 18, 1900 degrees
Yeah.
Fahrenheit. That's how hot a fire has to be. So if a fire is that hot, it's hot enough to melt silver. The silver burns through a piece of linen cloth, yet the egg yolk and the vinegar remain unscathed. I assume. I don't even know how that would work.
Here's what he says. Here's the recipe. He says for the tempera began with 1 egg yolk, 50 centimeters cubed of water, 50 centimeters cubed of malt vinegar stirred together, then 5 milliliters of this mixture was added to 0.5 grams of yellow ochre pigment. So that's his thing there.
I know exactly. I know scientifically. I know what that scientific formula is. I do. That's the actual scientific formula for very sour French toast. Yeah, that would make very sour French toast.
All right.
Yeah.
We're
But
changing.
Here's the thing that he is obviously either ignoring, deliberately missing, I don't know, thermally stable. Do you remember me mentioning that?
Mm-hmm.
Brian just said that silver melted through the linen. It would cause, did you ever burn an egg? I have. It would cause a discoloration throughout the shroud that simply is not there.
What's more, if you were cooking an egg at 1,732 degrees Fahrenheit, pretty sure the frying pan would be gone. Pretty sure. I mean, some things just make no sense. You look at some people and go, "Come on, man, really?"
Now that's what I wanted to ask you about Hugh's little French toast hypothesis here, because
Yes.
so one thing he does posit that the shroud was washed before so the image there was the paint on it originally, and then the acid in the vinegar created the dehydrated cellulose or something like that. But what Giulio found is that didn't happen in Hugh's actual experiments, right? So the image that we saw in Hugh's experiments were only due to the paint. There was no acidic effect. And Hugh just said, "Oh, well, you didn't give it the proper amount of time, or maybe if I mixed less egg yolk and more vinegar, it would do it." Do these excuses work because in your expertise there, Brian? Or
Yeah, scientifically, it only works if you use brown eggs instead of traditional white eggs. That's the only time it works. I mean, it's so laughable that it's ridiculous. It really is. I mean, he literally gave essentially the recipe for a very sour piece of French toast. That's what he just gave me.
What about Easter eggs? I have chickens that lay Easter eggs. You know, they're blue and green.
I say I have bunnies that lay Easter eggs. My bunnies lay eggs. Yeah, bunnies lay eggs now, which I'm sure Hugh must already know.
Yeah, he probably does.
So yeah, basically you're saying, look, in your expertise, this concoction won't result in the acidic effect creating images. It will always be due to the paint, if there's any image kind of thing.
Absolutely not. That's ridiculous.
All right. So Ken, my last follow-up on this issue specifically is for you, because as you said, you were in the room, you're an eyewitness. So one of the things Hugh critiques STURP with, when they took the samples, he says, well, look, the STURP did a horrible job. They didn't press those samples in to get a proper sample. It was so light that they didn't get anything but maybe minor debris.
Let me put the Quearitis to that right away. Number one, along with the scientists from the US that were STURP members, we had Dr. Max Frey, we had Giulio Ricci, we had Luigi Ganella. Everybody did something different. Now, what he's referring to, and I think it's very disingenuous, is STURP contacted Kodak and they created a roller that would use tape but wouldn't tear the shroud in removing particles. So that roller didn't have a lot of pressure going on to take the samples we took. However, standing right next to us was Dr. Max Frey. You probably are aware that he found all kinds of pollen samples on the shroud. Pollen from Jerusalem, pollen from Turkey, much more pollen from the historical areas that we believe the shroud was in than the pollen from Europe. Okay, but let me tell you how he did it. He had a regular roll of cellophane tape, put it on the shroud, and you could literally hear the fibers tearing as he pulled the tape away. So what Hugh is saying is, STURP didn't get any material because they didn't use pressure. Why didn't Max Frey get it? I was there. I saw him. In fact, some of the STURP scientists literally cringed when Max Frey was using his tape technique, because the shroud was literally being lifted up off the platform that we designed for it by the pressure he was using. Come on. These guys have to go to all kinds of extremes to hold some of the beliefs that they hold. I'm sorry. It just doesn't wash.
Thank you so much for that. So, all right. So I've got a couple other minimal relevant features or properties of the shroud. The other one is this issue of uniformity. And this is one where, number one, Hugh just outright denies that the shroud body images have the same uniform intensity of color. He says, no, there are provably varying degrees. And I'll just share my screen just to show you what he points to as proof. Again, I won't play the clip. So this is what Hugh Farey has shown us as proof that there's different varying degrees of color. Now he admits he's manipulated this, but he says whatever he did to get this result, he did it to every part uniformly. So he didn't cheat in doing different things to different parts, but he says, well, this isn't uniform. Look, some areas show up orange, others are lighter yellow and stuff. So that this claim that the shroud images, the body images have a uniform intensity of color is provably false, according to Hugh. And yeah, so I just want to get your guys' take on that. Is that true? How do we know that there is this uniformity of color on the shroud's images? And if there is this, how does Hugh's method perform on that front? Yeah, Brian, I'll start.
I'll let our chemist answer it, because again, to me, the whole premise is ridiculous.
It is indeed. I was actually going to defer that one to you, Ken, because I know that you were physically there, and again, I want to say again, remember, you have a man who was physically in the room Dr. Stevenson is one of the few people alive who has physically had his hands on the actual Shroud of Turin. I mean, think about that for a minute. He's one of the few men on this planet who's had his actual hands on the Shroud of Turin. And Ken, I know that uniformity is something that the entire team of scientists looked at very, very thoroughly.
Very carefully.
I think you could give a very
I-
well-rounded response to that.
They were very thorough. And these kinds of responses are not at all thorough. These kinds of responses, as I've said, and as Brian has said, are ridiculous, are ridiculous. And I think it's an attempt to avoid facts. If we can't avoid facts, let's muddy the waters. Let's muddy the waters. Let's create some confusion, and then we can justify what we want to believe. And I'm afraid on that note, I'm going to have to call it a day. I've got to prepare. I do have a funeral to prepare for in the morning. I appreciate you having me on the program. I especially appreciate my dear friend, Dr. Brian, because he's confirmed things that I've studied for 50 years. Let me end with this. He mentioned that my hands were on the shroud. And I'm just going to say this for you. For most of the testing, we use surgical gloves or cotton gloves. But at the end, the bishop said we had shown such respect that he allowed us to physically touch the shroud. I thought it was a precious thing. I really valued it. But it wasn't until years later that I was giving a talk. And as is my custom, I had a prayer line for people who wanted prayer. A little old lady came up and took my hands. And she held them like this. And she said, "These hands have touched the blood of Jesus. That's why there's healing in these hands." Honestly, Dale, I had never thought about it like that. Never once in my life. But our ministry has been known for healing. And I almost fell over when she said that. My hands, if I'm accurate in what I believe for nearly 50 years, my hands have touched the blood of Jesus. I'll end with that. God bless you. Thanks for having me.
God bless. Yeah, thank you so much for being here, Ken. So, oh, all right, cool. So, Brian, yeah, over to you. I do have one major area that I definitely want to get your take on in terms of Hugh's method. And it's something that he just totally neglects, the bloodstains. He didn't even attempt to reproduce the bloodstains. And I don't think it's enough. A lot of times shroud skeptics are like, well, if I can reproduce the body images, the bloodstains, obvious, they can take care of themselves. But what's your take on the blood stains and putting that together with Hugh's method for forming the body images? Can they go together and explain both? Or
Uh, your question is, can they go together? I would phrase it this way. His process of bas-relief cannot and never will be able to reproduce the results that a team of scientists found for the Shroud of Turin. That's number one, first and foremost. Secondly, regarding the blood on the actual Shroud of Turin, it has been analyzed at such a level that they found that it contains, it is actual human blood. It contains creatinine. These are all scientific tests that have been done. It contains creatinine, there's serum albumin. So the blood on the Shroud, beyond question, is real human blood. So my question to Hugh Farey or others would be, well, if you can reproduce the Shroud, why would you skip one of the most important pieces, the human blood? So it just doesn't hold water.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the issues is the question of, what came first? Were the blood stains put on the shroud first and then the body images formed, or vice versa? The body images formed and then the blood stains. Hugh takes the latter view, but I can see problems either way, right? It's like if the blood stains were formed on the shroud first, don't forget, Hugh has this method. He washes the cloth afterwards to get rid of the paint. Well, wouldn't that have gotten rid of the blood as well? Or so there's that issue. But even if it comes afterward, after the body images are put on, why would a medieval artist put things like the off-image bloodstains that people like Gilbert Lavoie saw, or with a bas relief, you literally don't have the sides of the faces. Haven't there been findings of bloodstains on the sides? But
Again, the things that you're mentioning just prove that his entire, I don't even like to call it a theory, his entire synopsis just literally makes no sense, and so much of it just on a common sense level. It just doesn't hold water in so many ways.
gotcha. All right, perfect. Well, I think that covers all the main areas that I wanted to ask about in terms of the, Giulio's 12 criteria. Let me ask you, is there anything else that I'm missing or I'm haven't been asking you about that is important for Hugh's image forming hypothesis and you think is important for people to know?
Uh, I can't pick one specific thing, but it is important to note that Giulio Fanti was able to prove that Hugh's theory failed on 8 out of 12 characteristics that are evident on the Shroud of Turin. So if you're failing on 8 out of 12, and again, one of those Ken and I spoke about where we felt that Giulio Fanti might be perhaps being a little bit more generous than we would be regarding the three dimensionality. And that's okay. Nothing against Giulio there, but you're talking about Hugh failed 8 out of 12 standard criteria and characteristics, which would have to be met for his theory to hold any water and for it to be possible. So again, if you're failing 8 out of 12 characteristics, it's pretty much tells you right there, yeah, this isn't the way, this isn't correct. This is not the way to do it.
Awesome. And I know I did think of something to ask you. Now, this isn't related to the scientific evidence, so if you don't have an answer, no worries. I brought you on as a scientific expert, but I know my friend Jack Markwart has really gone to task on Hugh from a historical aspect of the Quem Quearitis hypothesis. Do you know anything about the historical evidence about his hypothesis? Are there any objections there that you would like to raise, or is it mostly the science?
I'm not as up on that specific hypothesis right now. I haven't studied that in depth.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right, awesome. Well, yeah, I think that covers everything there. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your detailed knowledge. I know I always wanted you on once I found out you had a background in chemistry. I wanted you to come on to share your expertise there. Obviously having Ken was great too, but did you enjoy your time on your end?
Very much so. Love being here, and thank you again for having us on your wonderful show. We look forward to chatting with you again sometime.
Sounds great. You're welcome back anytime. All right.
Okay.
All right,
Thank
cool.
you, Dale.
No worries. So yeah, just so the audience knows, so next week I am bringing on an expert Christian apologist who deals with Jews and refuting Judaism to bring Christians to Christ and stuff like that as the Jewish Messiah. So that'll be Courtney Smith, and that will be next week. So look forward to that. And then on May 15th, I think Brian will appreciate this. I am having my ultimate resurrection panel. So this is a celebration to our mutual friend, Dr. Gary Habermas, and
Oh, great.
his 4 volume magnum opus that he's believe it or not, Brian, the same year Gary started writing his 4 volume book is the year I met him, and he's as a non-believer, and he started helping me come to Christ and look at the evidence. So
Great.
yeah, I'll be bringing Gary on with several experts: Sean McDowell, Mike Lacona, Tony Costa. I'm free. I'm forgetting somebody else. I'm sorry about that, but Ben Shaw, Gary's student. So it'll be a great event, and we'll be going over all of the evidence for the resurrection from a historical standpoint. So
Great. Excellent. I do have one other quick note for your viewers. I would very much encourage everyone to take a look at the website for Ken and I. It's www.theshroudofturin.org. That's www.theshroudofturin.org. Ken and I also wrote a book entitled The Shroud of Turin, The Perfect Summary. The objective in writing this book was to present a lot of factual information, but also to tie the spiritual with the chemical as well as the historical information surrounding the Shroud of Turin, but to do it in such a way that it's very comfortable reading. You won't read it and feel like, gee, I've got to have a chemistry degree or a PhD to understand this. No, it's really written at a very comfortable level, I would say, for everyone. And again, the book is called The Shroud of Turin, The Perfect Summary. You can actually get your free copy of this book at our website, www.theshroudofturin.org/free book, FREEBOOK. And if you go there, the book will be available. And we currently have the book translated into 7 languages. The book is available, again, free in all languages, in English, Hebrew, Spanish, French, Portuguese, Italian, and Urdu. So yeah, 7 languages right now. And again, you feel free to download any or all of those at no charge whatsoever. Again, you can get that at our website, www.theshroudofturin.org/free book, FREEBOOK.
So, yep. And I'll include those links on the video description and my blog. So you can just click and go over there. So yeah, thank
That's
you so
great.
much and have a great day.
Thank you so much, Dale. Thanks for having us, and you have a great day.